Okay, so I'm going to present our study on the drivers of demand for animal source food in low-income households in Nairobi. This is a joint study between the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, University College London, and the University of Nairobi. I am Aurelia Lepine, and this project is led by Paula Dominguez-Salas. So the main objective of this research is to identify the drivers of animal source food purchase, consumption, and nutritional status. And what we really try to do is to include all potential drivers, so drivers from the demand side, but also drivers from the supply side. So I would say that this study is innovative in the sense that it does include methods and tools from very different disciplines, and this is due to the multidisciplinary nature of the project that included nutritionists, economists, and anthropologists. So as a result, we adopt a mixed method approach where the quantitative analysis is complemented by a qualitative method in order to document the role of traditional norms, belief, and intra-household dynamics. So let me present you the three main tools, the three main components of this research. So the first one is the household survey. So we conducted a survey among 300 low-income households who were living in an informal settlement in Nairobi called Dagoretti North. So the eligibility criteria included so we had like a maximum amount of money. So we only included households who were earning less than 30,000 shillings. And we were only interested in a household where the two spouses were living together, given the strong focus on women's empowerment in this study, and also only included a household in which there was a young child. So we collected information on animal source food consumptions, but also on several markers of nutrition, such as anthropometrics measure and hemoglobin level to measure anemia. So part of this survey, we had extensive information collected on all the socio-economic demographic determinants. And we also had a game, an experimental game that was used in order to measure women's bargaining power. And I will present that in the next slide. So for every household included, we asked the household about the three closest beef retailers. And we went to those beef retailers in order to collect information on the availability of food sold in those retailers, but also on their price and on their quality. And finally, what we did is that we complemented these quantitative tools by a qualitative survey that included a number of focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and in-depth interviews. So just to present the basic descriptive statistics, so what is interesting in this context is that we observe a double burden of malnutrition in which we can see the coexistence of a high proportion of children who are stunted. So it's 18% of children who are stunted. And at the same time, their mothers are largely overweight or obese. So there is this double burden of malnutrition. So we also observe that anemia level among children is pretty high, so it's 11%. However, we can see that the consumption of animal source food was also high among women and children. It's only 13% and 9% of women and children, respectively, who have not consumed animal source food in the last 24 hours. So regarding the experimental measure of women's empowerment, so I mentioned, so this is quite an innovative tool that we've used, since we are the one who developed this new measure of women's empowerment. And we did that because in the literature, there is strong evidence showing that women's empowerment matters for women's nutrition, but also for child nutrition. However, it's very hard to measure women's empowerment in a study, and it's also there is some evidence that it's hard to believe that self-reported measure of women's empowerment do really measure women's empowerment in a good way. So what we did instead, we developed an experimental economic game in which we ask women to make 11 choices. So the choices women were making was either to receive an amount of money for their husband or for themselves. And I need to point out that this game was incentivized and the money was effectively received by either the husband or the women. So the first choice was, do you prefer receiving nothing for you, or that your husband receives 500 shillings? And for this choice, most women would choose option A. And then what we did is that we increased the amount of money received by the women. And what we're using as a proxy for women's empowerment is actually the switch points. So the points at which the women start accept to receive the money for herself. So the idea here is that if the women accept switch at a low level, at the first choice, it means that she's willing to give up a large amount of money for her husband to get the money for herself. And this is consistent with the lower women's empowerment. So the main drivers of animal source food and nutrition we find was the price, the distance to the retailers, women's empowerment, and income. So precisely, we find a price elasticity of demand of 1.9, which means that when the price increases by 10%, then the demand for beef decreases by 19%. We find that the distance to the beef retailer was associated with lower dietary diversity and worse nutritional outcomes for women and children. We also find that women's empowerment was a main driver of animal source food consumption, but also of nutrition, especially of anemia for women and anthropometric measure for children. And finally, we find that richer households had more diverse diet and larger consumption of animal source food. Thank you very much.